The debris field was still warm when the ardent vigil arrived. 11 days had passed since the colony ship went silent. 11 days since. The last automated signal bounced off a relay station near the edge of mapped space and arrived at Coalition headquarters as nothing more than a location stamp and a flat, dead frequency. No voices, no emergency codes, just silence, which in space means something final. Commander Cyril had seen wreckage before. She was Drenathy, tall, compound-eyed, with a mind that organized grief the same way it organized data, efficiently, and after the work was done, she stood at the forward observation panel and looked at what remained of the human vessel without expression. Hull sections, frozen cargo, personal items spinning slowly in the void. The usual proof that something large had once existed and then stopped. Scanning for life signs, said the junior officer at the sensor console. There will not be any, said Warrant Officer Durek from his position near the security station. He was Vorith, broad, scaled, with a soldier's habit of stating what he believed to be true before evidence confirmed it. 11 days. No power signature on approach. Whatever happened here, it finished itself. Cyril said nothing. She watched the scanner. The junior officer went quiet. Then, Commander, there is something. Durek turned. Interference artifact. No, sir. It is faint, but it is consistent. Pod 7. Emergency sealed. Life sign small. 1. The silence on the bridge changed character. Cyril was already moving. Ready a retrieval team. Dr. Uvel to the landing bay. They pulled the pod with a tow arm because the docking collar had buckled. The pod itself was damaged. One side crushed inward, a slow pressure leak that had been fighting against the emergency seal for 11 days and nearly won. When the retrieval team cut it open, the atmosphere that came out was thin and stale and barely breathable. Inside, curled against the back wall with both knees pulled to its chest, was a human child. Dr. Uvel, who had spent 14 years studying xenobiology and believed himself to be a calm individual, took one look and stood very still for a moment before he remembered to breathe. The child was small, pale, dark-haired. It appeared to be female, approximately 7 years of age by the proportions, and it was alive in the way that something is alive when it has spent 11 days deciding, over and over, not to stop. Malnourished, Uvel said, switching to professional habit because professional habit was the only thing keeping his voice even. Mild radiation exposure. Dehydration. She is stable, but this is not possible. Biologically speaking, this is not possible. And yet, said Cyril, they moved the child to the medical bay. She did not wake during transport. She did not wake when Uvel began his assessment, or when the ship's systems were adjusted to bring the temperature up to human comfortable range, or when Missa, the junior medic, set up a fluid line with the careful, focused expression of someone doing a thing they had never done before. She woke 3 hours later. It happened quietly. No sound, no movement at first, just the shift in her vitals that the monitor caught, and then her eyes, dark brown, the color of deep soil, and entirely, completely awake, opened and looked at the ceiling, then at the walls, then at Uvel, who was sitting at his console 2 meters away, and turned to find her watching him with an expression he could not read. He consulted his training. His training said, speak calmly, move slowly, avoid direct eye contact with a human in distress, as this can be perceived as a challenge. He looked slightly to the left of her face and said, in the translated standard, that the ship's language system produced, you are safe. You are aboard a coalition vessel. You are not in danger. The child looked at him, said nothing. Uvel noted this in his log as non-responsive. He sent a general notice to the crew. Human juvenile aboard. Follow advisory protocols. Maintain respectful distance. Durek read the notice in the security office and pulled up the coalition database entry on humans. He had read it before, during basic service training. But he read it again now. The entry was long. It mentioned physical resilience, in terms that, applied to an adult, were already concerning. Applied to a juvenile that had survived 11 days in a broken pod on nothing, they were something else entirely. He added a note to his security log. Subject is young. Subject is also human. Do not conflate the two with safety. He began running a passive monitoring protocol on all corridors the child might access. In the medical bay, Oval offered the child food, a standard nutrient pack, the closest thing to human-appropriate rations they had aboard. She looked at it, looked at him, did not take it. Missa, passing through to check the fluid line, set a second pack on the edge of the bed without looking at the child and went back to her console. 20 minutes later, the first pack was gone. Oval noted this too. He did not yet understand what it meant. He filed it under behavioral data, inconclusive, and went back to his report. The child lay still and watched the ceiling and the walls and the people who moved through the room. She did not speak. She did not cry. She had learned, in 11 days alone in a broken box at the edge of nothing, that neither of those things changed very much. But she watched. She watched everything. Nobody on the Ardent Vigil had ever been responsible for a child before. That was the problem Oval kept running into when he tried to apply logic to the situation. He had protocols. He had database entries. He had a 14-page coalition advisory document titled Interaction Guidelines, Human Juveniles in Non-Human Care Settings, which he had read 4 times now and which kept telling him things like maintain routine stimulation and provide tactile comfort objects without explaining what those things meant when the child in question had not spoken a single word in 6 days and ate only when Missa was somewhere in the room. He had set up the enrichment tools exactly as recommended. 3 Drenathy learning blocks, shapes, colors, logic sequences, arranged on the tray beside her bed. The child had looked at them once. She had not touched them. He had adjusted the lighting to the warmer end of the spectrum, as advised. He had maintained a consistent temperature. He had spoken to her twice a day, in measured tones, updating her on the ship's status as if she were a crew member receiving a briefing, because the database said human children responded well to being treated as capable individuals. The child listened to these briefings with the same expression she used for everything else, attentive, contained, and completely unreadable. On the morning of day 7, Oval filed a report. Behavioral status, within parameters. Psychological status, non-responsive. Physical recovery, progressing normally. He recommended transfer to a human facility at first available opportunity. The nearest one was 22 days away. That evening, Missa stayed late. She had not planned to. Her shift ended at standard hour 19 and she had a full day ahead. But she had come to check the fluid line. The child was fully hydrated now and the line was due to come out, and she found the child awake, sitting with her back against the wall, watching the door as if she was waiting for something that kept not arriving. Missa removed the line. She documented it. She should have left. Instead, she sat down on the floor, not near the bed, not close enough to crowd, just on the floor against the opposite wall, with her back against the cool metal and her legs stretched out, the way she used to sit as a young trainee when the study rooms were too loud, and she needed somewhere quiet to think. The child watched her. Missa did not perform anything. She did not speak, or smile, or offer anything. She was simply present, another living thing in the same room, not demanding, not leaving. After a long time, the child moved. Slowly, she slid off the bed and sat on the floor too, 1.5 meters away. She did not look at Missa directly. She looked at the same middle distance. They sat like that for 40 minutes. When Missa got up to leave, the child was asleep on the floor. Missa considered moving her back to the bed. Instead, she took the light blanket from the mattress and set it carefully over the child's shoulders without waking her. Then she left. She mentioned it to Oval the next morning. He listened. He said, "It may be coincidence." She was tired. Missa nodded and said nothing else. But the child ate breakfast that morning, a full portion, without being coaxed. Durek, meanwhile, had moved from passive monitoring to active concern. He arrived at Cyril's office on day 8 with a data pad and a prepared argument. The child should be in a secured compartment, he said. The silence was not normal. Quiet in a predator species was a learned behavior. You went still when you were measuring something. You went silent when you were preparing. Cyril looked at him for a moment. She is 7 years old, Cyril said. Human developmental literature indicates cognitive maturity significantly exceeds physical maturity in their early years, Durek said. I have notes. She weighs 18 kilograms, Durek. With respect, Commander, that is not. She has not spoken. She has not moved aggressively. She has not attempted to access any restricted area. She has sat in the medical bay for 8 days and watched us move around her. Cyril set the data pad down on her desk. The things you are describing are not the behaviors of a predator hunting. They are the behaviors of a child who has lost everything and is trying to understand where she is. Durek did not argue further, but he did not remove the monitoring protocols. That night, Uvel went back through the database entry on human juveniles. He had read the warning sections. Now he read the development sections, which were longer and less dramatic, in which he had initially skimmed. One line stopped him. Human juvenile psychological development is anchored almost entirely in proximity to a consistent caregiver. Without this anchor, the organism enters a state of chronic stress regardless of whether all physical needs are met. The child is not malfunctioning. The child is searching. Uvel sat with that sentence for a long time. Then he filed a revised report. He kept the transfer recommendation, but he added a note at the bottom, in his own words, separate from the official assessment. The child is not a risk. The child is grieving. These are not the same thing, and the crew should understand the difference. He did not know if anyone would read the note. In the morning, the learning blocks were still untouched on the tray, but the child had moved them. They were now arranged in a neat line by the wall, out of the way, as if she was clearing space for something she had not yet decided on. Uvel noted this. He did not know what it meant. He was beginning to think the database did not know either. The feed from Corridor 7 played on a small loop in the corner of Durek's screen, because Durek had told himself he was watching it professionally and not because it was the 4th time he had watched it in the same hour. The child. Nail. The crew had started calling her Nail. He had no idea who started it first. Had been given supervised access to 3 non-restricted corridors on day 9. Supervised by Missa, who walked behind her at a respectful distance and watched with the look of someone who had stopped pretending this was routine medical observation and was now simply curious about another creature. The child moved through the ship the way she did everything. Slowly. Looking at things. Not touching. Just looking, with those dark eyes that Durek found difficult to assess because they gave nothing away and took everything in. She had stopped outside the engine bay. The bay was technically unrestricted. Crew only, but no security designation. Through the open service hatch she could see Rhett, the young Vorith maintenance technician, replacing a secondary coupling on the port drive relay. Rhett was 23 years old, had never served on a posting with humans before, and had spent the first week of the child's presence on the ship going the long way around every corridor to avoid passing the medical bay. He noticed her standing in the hatch entrance because she had been standing there for 11 minutes without moving. What? He said, which was not welcoming but was at least a word. The child did not move. She looked at the coupling in his hand, then at the relay housing, then back at the coupling. Rhett stared at her. Then, because he was annoyed at being watched and because explaining things was somehow less uncomfortable than silence, he held up the part. Coolant flow coupler. It is cracked. I am replacing it. He pointed to the housing. Goes here. This side up. The child looked at the housing. Then she looked at the tool rack on the wall. To his left. She pointed. Rhett turned to look. The alignment wrench he needed for the next step was exactly where she had pointed. He had been about to stand up and get it. He paused. Took the wrench. Set the coupler. Said nothing. The child watched him complete the job. She did not move until he was done. Then she turned and walked back down the corridor, and Missa followed. Durek watched this clip 4 times. In his official log, under the heading, Threat Assessment, Day 14, he wrote, Observed Behavior, Subject. Watch Technician Rhett complete maintenance work on port coupling assembly. Anticipated required tool and indicated location before subject was asked. Behavioral pattern consistent with observational learning and environmental mapping at accelerated rate. He read it back. Then he opened a new line under that and wrote, This is not what a predator does before it strikes. This is what something does when it is trying to find a way to be useful. He deleted the second line. Then he wrote it again. Then he left it. On day 16, he turned a corner and nearly walked through her. She was standing in the corridor. A loud corridor, nothing wrong. Missa was 3 seconds behind, and Durek's combat training did the thing it always did, which was activate before thought. He stopped. His hand moved toward the sidearm at his belt and stopped there without drawing, because he caught up with his own reflexes half a second later and recognized what he was looking at. A child, 70 centimeters tall, looking up at him. They stood still, both of them. The corridor was narrow, and there was no natural way to be in it together without one of them moving. Nell looked at him for 5 full seconds. Then, with the slow, deliberate care of someone who understood exactly what her presence was doing to the large, armed creature in front of her, she took one step to the side. She stood against the wall. She waited. Durek walked past her. He did not look back. He filed the encounter as no incident and stood in the security office for a while thinking about a 7-year-old who already understood how to give a frightened soldier space and chose to use that knowledge gently. By day 18, Red had stopped going the long way around. He did not announce this or explain it. He simply stopped, and when Nail appeared at the engine bay hatch during his afternoon shift, he pointed at the empty floor space beside his workstation in the manner of someone granting access to territory. Nail sat. She watched. She handed him tools at the correct moments, which happened more and more often. Rhett worked. He occasionally identified parts aloud for no stated reason. She listened to every word. On day 19, Commander Cyril received a routing message from Coalition Logistics. The new distress call that had been flagged 2 days ago had been officially assigned to the Ardent Vigil. They were the nearest vessel. The detour would add 30 days to their journey. The human transfer facility would now be 52 days away. Cyril confirmed the new route and called a brief crew meeting to inform everyone. The crew absorbed this information with professional calm. After the meeting, Cyril sat alone in her office and looked at the route map. 52 days. 7 weeks. She thought about the child who had survived 11 days alone and was now handing the right tools to a Vorth soldier who had spent 2 weeks going the long way around to avoid her. She thought, this ship is changing. Slowly. Without permission. She thought, I am not sure I have the authority to stop it, even if I wanted to. She approved the route. She closed the map. Down the corridor, in the engine bay, Rhett said the word for secondary relay. In Vorth, without looking up, and Nail, without being asked, handed him exactly the right part. The first sign was a sound. Not an alarm. Those came later. The first sign was a low harmonic groan that traveled through the ship's hull plating from somewhere deep in the drive section, the kind of sound that experienced crew felt in their feet before they heard it with their ears. Rhett heard it from the engine bay and was already moving before the diagnostic panel lit up. Cyril heard it on the bridge and had her hand on the intercom before the second vibration followed. What followed was not a catastrophe. That was important later when they talked about it. A coolant cascade in the secondary drive manifold, a serious fault but a manageable one, the kind that required immediate shutdown of the FDL drive, emergency seals in 3 sections, and a hard 30-minute window to bring temperature levels down before structural damage became a possibility. The kind of fault that the Ardent Vigil's crew was trained for. The kind that still turned the lights red and filled every corridor with the flat, rapid tone of the emergency system announcing itself in Drenethi and Vorth, neither of which were languages a 7-year-old human child understood. Nail was alone in the bunk room. Mrs. Shift had moved that week. She was on the other side of the ship, pulling the emergency seal protocol with the rest of the technical crew, when the lights went red. She tried to reach Oval on the intercom. The channels were full of damage control traffic. The bunk room was in a stable section. No vacuum risk, no heat issue, no reason to prioritize it in the first 10 minutes of a controlled emergency. Nail was in no physical danger. She was also alone, in red light, listening to alarms in 2 languages neither of which said anything she could understand, and this was how she had last been. Alone when everything went wrong. Nobody had time to think about this. Everyone was working the fault. Crewman Bella had a bad cut. He was 21, a junior engineer, and he had been in the secondary corridor when the first hull vibration hit the overhead piping bracket and it came loose. Not a serious wound. Clean, but deep across the forearm, the kind that bled in a way that looked worse than it was. Hey, medic had looked at it and told him firmly to go to the corridor near the medical bay and wait. Oval was in the middle of two other things. Sit down. Hold pressure. We will get to you. Bella sat down in the corridor. The lights were still red. The alarms had dropped to a lower tone, which meant the worst was contained, but everything was still loud and everything was still the wrong color. Nell found him. She came from the direction of the bunk room. She moved through the red-lit corridor and she stopped when she saw him sitting against the wall with his arm held against his chest. She looked at him. She looked at the cloth he was holding against the wound. She looked at his face. Bella was not one of the crew who had spent time with her. He was not afraid of her exactly. He was too junior and too distracted for the kind of structured concern Durek maintained, but he was aware of her in the way the whole crew was aware of her, the way you are aware of something that has been categorized as requiring awareness. He sat against the wall and looked at this small human child standing in the corridor with red light on her face, and he thought, with the vague clarity of someone who had been mildly injured and was waiting alone, I do not know what she is going to do. What she did was sit down beside him, not across from him, beside him, close enough that her shoulder was near his arm. She looked down the corridor in the same direction he was looking, and she reached out and put her hand over his, the hand holding the cloth to the wound, and she held it there. She did not look at him. She did not speak. She just held his hand on the cloth and looked down the empty red corridor like she was on watch. Bella did not move. He thought about moving, because coalition guidelines about contact with human juveniles were something he had read in basic orientation. But the thought did not go anywhere because the honest truth was that after several minutes of sitting alone in an emergency with a bleeding arm, having another living thing sit down next to him and stay was doing something to his nervous system that he could not immediately categorize. He felt calmer. That was the word for it. Calmer. The emergency resolved. Lights came back. Missa found them in the corridor and stopped in the doorway of the medical bay with an expression that went through several phases very quickly. Then she came over and took care of Bella's arm, and Nail moved back without being asked, giving space, and sat against the opposite wall and waited until it was done. Later, Bella told Oval about it. He included the part about feeling calmer because he felt it was medically relevant. He also said, unprompted, that he thought he had spent too much time this voyage being afraid of the wrong thing. Oval wrote it down. The emergency review meeting covered the fault, the repair timeline, and injury tally. At the end, Cyril asked, quietly, whether anyone believed Nail should be moved to a secured compartment for the rest of the journey. She waited. Durek looked at the table, said nothing, did not vote yes. Everyone else said no. That night, Cyril walked past the bunk room. The door was partly open. Inside, Nail was asleep on the floor again. She still preferred the floor, with the light blanket over her and the red emergency light long since replaced by the quiet blue of standard night mode. She was on her side, face turned toward the door, completely still. Cyril stood in the doorway. She looked at the child who had survived 11 days alone in a broken pod by deciding, over and over, not to stop. She looked at the child who had, tonight, sat down next to a frightened young engineer in a red-lit corridor and simply refused to let him be alone in it. Cyril went back to her quarters. For the first time in 4 years, she opened a personal channel and sent a message home to her own daughter, who was 12 and busy and would probably reply in 3 days. The message said, I am well. I have been thinking about you. That is all. It happened on a Tuesday, if you kept human days, which nobody on the Ardent Vigil did. By ship's calendar, it was day 31 of the voyage. 2 weeks past the engine fault. 11 days before the transfer. Rhett was working a full diagnostic on the port relay. Full diagnostics took about 2 hours and involved a specific sequence of steps that had to be done in a specific order, and somewhere around week 3, he had stopped explaining the steps out loud as instruction and started doing it because the silence was worse. Or perhaps because the small human sitting on the floor beside his workstation seemed to track the sequence better when he said the words, and he had developed the vague professional satisfaction of watching someone understand something quickly. She had been collecting words for 2 weeks now. Not from lessons, Missa had tried twice, with simple picture cards, and Nail had looked at them with polite patience and not engaged. The words she collected were the ones that belonged to things. The Vorith word for each engine part, in the order it appeared in the diagnostic sequence. The Drenithi word for temperature, pressure, stable, and weight, which were the 4 words Uval used most often. The standard coalition word for all right, which Missy used every time she finished checking something, as a small, unconscious announcement that everything was fine. Nobody had asked her to learn any of this. She learned it because it was there, and because learning the words for things was a way of learning the shape of the place she was in, and learning the shape of the place she was in was how she had survived 11 days in a box, and how she intended to survive whatever came next. On day 31, Rhett was reaching for the secondary housing clamp, and he said, without looking up, Drel Vok, which was the Vorith technical word for a specific kind of internal coupler, not a common word, not something that appeared in any basic language guide, a word she had heard him use exactly 4 times in 3 weeks. Nail picked up the part from the tray and put it in his hand. Rhett stopped, looked at the part in his hand, looked at her. She looked back, waiting. Rhett put the part down. He picked it up again. He set his diagnostic tool on the floor and sat back on his heels and looked at this small human child who had just correctly identified a secondary drive coupler by its technical Vorith designation without being asked, on the 4th occasion she had ever heard the word, after 31 days of not speaking any word in any language to any crew member ever. He said, quietly, Drel Vok. She said, clearly and correctly, Drel Vok. Rhett sat on the floor. He did not immediately get back up. This was noted by the monitoring system, which flagged an activity pause in the engine bay for about 4 minutes, which Durek reviewed and labeled non-incident with a brevity that did not reflect how long he had sat looking at the timestamp before he filed it. After that, Nail spoke. Not to everyone, not in speeches, not in the way that suggested she had been holding back language like water behind a dam. She spoke the way she had done everything on this ship, slowly, precisely, only when the word fit the moment like the right part fits the right coupling. She said the Drenithi word for warm when Missa adjusted the room temperature. She said the Vorith word for complete when Rhett finished a job. She said the coalition standard word for all right in the exact tone and cadence she had learned from Missa, which meant Missa had to go and take a very long drink of water before she could respond calmly. She did not explain herself. She did not apologize for 31 days of silence. She had been learning the language of the place she was in, and now she had enough of it to begin, and so she began. Durek, by day 35, was compiling the official handoff documentation for the human facility. He went back through his log. Every entry, 40 days, of threat assessments and behavioral monitoring and carefully worded evaluations of risk. He read them in order, start to finish. When he finished, he sat for a while. Then he opened a new file and began again. Not a threat assessment. A record. Day by day, what the child had actually done. Not what it might indicate about danger. What it said about the creature itself, that it had arrived in pieces and had spent 5 weeks, quietly and without complaint, putting itself back together using whatever materials were available, which had turned out to be a Vorith soldier's maintenance vocabulary and a young medic's habit of saying, all right, when things were fine. He was filing this new document under crew welfare when he felt something touch his hand. He looked down. Nell stood beside his console. She had come into the security office, not a restricted area, but not somewhere she had been before. She was holding something small, a figure folded from the foil wrapper of a meal pack, made with a precision that suggested she had been working on it for a while in private, small, neat, unclear in shape. He could not tell if it was meant to be an animal, a vehicle, or something with no category. She placed it in his hand. Then she left. Durek held the foil shape in his palm. He did not move for a long time. A Vorith officer. 42 years old. 11 years of service. 17. Postings. He had held a great many things in this hand over those 11 years, and known immediately what each one was for. He turned the little shape over. He still could not tell what it was. He set it on the edge of the console, next to the intercom panel, where he could see it. He did not move it for the rest of the voyage. The HSV Meridian came alongside at 0600 ship time, which is the kind of hour that feels significant even when nothing is scheduled to feel significant. It was a human vessel, smaller than the Ardent Vigil but purpose-built, clean, and warm-colored where the Coalition ship was gray and efficient. It held alongside for 12 minutes before the docking collar sealed, and for those 12 minutes the bridge crew of the Ardent Vigil watched it through the forward panel in the particular silence of people who have not yet decided how they feel about what is about to happen. The human care team came through the hatch at 0614. 3 of them. They were professional and warm in the way that people are when their entire job is making difficult things gentler. The lead was a woman named Dr. Wren, who had a short gray streaked braid and moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this exact thing many times and understood exactly how much weight it carried every time. She shook Commander Cyril's hand. Human custom, Cyril had read about it. She had not expected it to feel so deliberate, and said that they had reviewed the medical records and Dr. Uvel's reports and were glad the child had been in such capable care. Cyril said, "We did what we could because it was the most honest thing and also the shortest." Dr. Wren asked to meet Nail. Of course. Nail was waiting in the corridor outside the medical bay with Mrs. standing behind her at the respectful, specific distance she had maintained for 42 days, the distance that said "I am here, not I am guarding you." Nail watched Dr. Wren approach. She watched the way a person watches something new. All of her attention, none of her expression. Dr. Wren crouched down to her level. She said, in plain, easy words, that her name was Wren, that she was a doctor, and that her ship had lots of other humans on it, and a room that was made for Nail, and food that was human food, and that everything was going to be all right. It was a good speech, careful and kind. Nail listened to all of it. Then she looked past Dr. Wren at the corridor, and at the ship beyond it, and at the crew of the Ardent Vigil standing in the arranged professional line that Coalition protocol required for formal transfers, and she did not move for a moment. Then she walked forward. She stopped in front of Uvel first. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. She reached out and touched his arm, 2 fingers, lightly, the way you touch something you want to remember the shape of. Uvel said nothing. His compound eyes did not have expressions that translated to human faces, but his stillness said something that did not need translation. She moved down the line. Bella. He was standing very straight in the formal line, and he went less straight. When she stopped in front of him and put her hand briefly on his forearm, the arm she had held in the red corridor 4 weeks ago, he said quietly, "Okay," which was not a Coalition farewell and was not correct procedure, but was the most real thing he had to offer. Rhett was at the end of the technical crew section. He did not look at her face. When she stopped, he looked at the wall just above her head in the manner of someone who has made a decision about what their face is going to do and is enforcing it. She touched his arm. He gave one short nod. That was all. She stopped in front of Durek last. Durek was standing exactly as regulation required, feet set, hands at his sides, posture formal. He had been standing exactly that way for 4 minutes, and he intended to continue standing exactly that way for however long this took, because he was a warrant officer of 11 years service, and he was not going to let a child's transfer ceremony be the thing that broke his composure on a formal occasion. Nell looked up at him for a long moment. Then she put her hand on his arm, and she left it there a second longer than she had with anyone else. Durek did not move. His jaw was very tight. She took her hand away. She turned. She walked with Dr. Wren through the corridor toward the docking hatch, and the crew of the Ardent Vigil watched her go in the silence of the formal line that protocol required. At the hatch she stopped. She turned back. She looked at the line of alien faces, compound eyes, scaled skin, colors and shapes that belonged to no Earth animal, looking back at her. The crew of a ship that had met her with fear and protocols and carefully maintained distance and had, over 42 days, quietly and without planning, to become something else. She said, in clear Drenathy, the word that Missa had taught her in week 1. Velshawn. I will remember. The hatch closed. The docking collar released at 0701. The Meridian's drives engaged and it pulled away and was a point of moving light, and then a smaller point of light, and then part of the general field of stars. The ardent vigil resumed its course. Crew returned to stations. Durek filed. The transfer complete at 0704 and returned to the security office and sat, without doing anything in particular for 11 minutes, which was unusual, and which the monitoring system noted, and which nobody flagged. In the engine bay, Rhett started a full diagnostic on the starboard relay. He did not say the component names out loud. The bay was quiet in a way it had not been for several weeks. On the small ledge beside the tool rack, where she used to sit, he set one small square of foil from the afternoon. Meal pack, folded flat. He did not move it. He would not move it. Missa wrote a note in the ship's personal record, an unofficial appendix. Not part of the mission log, filed under her own name. She wrote that everything they had needed to know about human juveniles had not been in any protocol document. It had been in the fact that a frightened creature in the dark had needed one thing, and that the one thing had cost nothing, and that it had been almost withheld anyway. She wrote, someone had to decide to sit down on the floor. Commander Cyril stood at the viewport long after the Meridian was gone. She thought about what she had expected when they pulled that pod from the wreck. She thought about the database entry with its warnings. She thought about Durek's security logs, now filed quietly under crew welfare. She thought, we went looking for the predator. She thought, what we found was the part of the human that makes the predator worth fearing at all. They do not let go. Not of life. Not of the people who stayed. The stars did not move. The ship moved through them, and the crew went back to work, and the viewport was empty, and Cyril stayed there anyway a little longer, thinking about a child who had crossed the dark alone and arrived at the other side, still watching, still learning, still reaching for whatever shape of home she could find in the materials available. She had found one. That was the thing. She had found one.